Good morning, everyone. My name is Luleka Dlamini. I am a master's student at UCT, so I'm clearly not an expert in this, but I have some information that I wish to share with you today. So I will touch base on what the climate system is, just to give you a bit of background of why we say the climate is variable and what has been happening throughout and what are the implications for South Africa. I'll also give a brief review of what recently came out, which is the IPCC special report on 1.5 and why they have specifically chosen to look at 1.5 and not 2 degrees or 3 degrees warming. So just to start you off, this is a basic view of what the climate system is. It's a very complex system. It's very dynamic. It changes over time. It changes over scale. It has many processes that are interacting with each other. So when we define a climate system, we define it as something that is interacting amongst these different spheres, the atmosphere, the biosphere, your hydrological sphere, and all these interactions in the end lead up to the change of what the climate we see today. Our main source, as we know, is it's the sun, and whatever the amount of radiation that we receive from the sun will ultimately influence all the things that happen within our climate system. For example, we have different areas within our globe. We know that we don't receive the same amount of radiation from the sun, which ultimately bring about the changes between your tropical areas and the areas within your poles because they don't receive a certain amount of sun and so forth. And we also have a change in seasons. That also has to do with how the Earth is around and how much radiation actually receives it at a particular time. So all these things interact with each other and they ultimately lead to a change in our climate. So just to kind of zoom in with what we have all seen, people talking about greenhouse gas effect and what that actually means. So if you look at the first side of the plot, we know that we get radiation from the sun, right? And some of it will be scattered in the atmosphere because we have different gases that are there that act as buffers. We have clouds that are there that kind of reflects that back into the atmosphere, but some of it kind of radiates back into the surface, which actually makes life possible on Earth. But at the same time, these gases are now increasing based on what we are currently doing, deforestation and increasing of fossil fuels. So instead of just receiving that amount of energy from the sun, we've actually kind of increased the temperature, which then ultimately falls through the Earth. We can kind of think about it as a blanket. So we have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, your CO2, your water vapor, and so forth. And these gases, when they're out there, they reflect what is coming from the sun, but they also reflect what is coming from the Earth itself. So what comes down from the sun is your solar radiation. They will reflect that back, and the amount of energy that we receive is actually smaller. But if you look at what we have in this scenario, whereby we have greenhouse gases, which are not only now just trapping what is coming from the sun, but they're also trapping what is coming out of the Earth itself. And that ultimately leads to the warming of our surfaces. So instead of just receiving that amount of energy, we are actually receiving more than what we're supposed to, which ultimately leads to an increase in temperatures within our Earth surfaces. And that's what we refer to as the greenhouse effect. Without the atmosphere, obviously we know life would not be possible. We still need the atmosphere as it is because it kind of regulates and kind of limits the amount of radiation we receive. What makes it worse is that we have kind of increased our greenhouse gases, and they also act as buffers. So instead of letting out this radiation that comes from the surface itself, it kind of sits there and makes everything warmer than what is normally has been seen. The climate also is very variable. Things change over time and they change over a certain scale. So there are certain things that happen in few minutes, and there are certain things that happen over a very long span. So if you think of a couple of days before, we had a cold front in Cape Town. It kind of hit us first. We had rain, it was cold. Now it's different. It has kind of shifted to a different space. the other side of the country will be receiving a different weather and so forth. So things change over time, and it's also based on how these different processes kind of act against each other. If we look at, again, your seasonal cycles, we know that we have summer, we have winter, we have autumn, and we have spring. At all those different times, they happen at different scale. The scale is the same, rather, in terms of time. We know it's about 3 months. But where they happen, it's different. When we have summer here, it's winter in the north. That's based on how the earth tilts and how it shifts around and how much of the radiation actually is received at that particular point and so forth. So all those things bring about different changes, and some of them are natural, as the seasonal climates are and the seasons are. Those are natural things, but the way that we have kind of increased our fossil fuels and how that has actually kind of buffered that greenhouse gas, that has now led to what we call climate variations and global impact. So whatever we do in South Africa will not be limited to here, but it will also have implications on what happens in the other side of the world. Take, for example, ENSO. ENSO is it's a big model change. So what normally happens, or how we define it, is that it's a change. We look at the sea surface temperature, which happens in the eastern part Pacific of the ocean. So if that temperature changes there, it has an effect on what we receive in South Africa as our climate. So normally you will see people, or you hear people saying, oh, there's a drought in South Africa, and it's because of El Nino. So when the sea surface temperature is above normal, that results in different climate which we'll receive here. Our temperature kind of gets a bit higher and drier. Instead of getting wetter winters in Western Cape, you'll have a bit of colder and drier season. So those are global. It's a global thing that happens there, but it has an effect here. And that also means that even though if that particular phenomenon happens, it doesn't mean that in America or in other parts of the world that they will receive the same effect. It will be different because it changes between scale, and it changes with the different things that are happening at that particular point and time. I hope it makes sense. I'm trying to simplify things, but I hope it makes sense. Another example that I want to show is that these processes have feedbacks. So what they do, like a feedback of a greenhouse gas, we burn the fossil fuels, it goes up, the gases stay there. They are supposed to do their job. They know they trap these things out, and when they do that, instead of radiating that energy out, that thing kind of reflects back to the atmosphere, to the surface, and it gets warmer. So those are the kind of feedbacks that happen, and those are the things that will ultimately lead to a different climate. So if you take, for example, initially, we know that in summer we need to have rainfall. It's supposed to rain because we'll have high temperatures. That will lead to evaporation, and the evaporation will lead to cloud formation. The cloud formation after some time will lead to precipitation. So if that kind of thing happens, it's normal, it's fine. But when things kind of change within that particular system, you'll have increased precipitation, and that's due to the fact that we have forest, and we talk about do not cut down the trees because this has an effect. How does it have an effect? Is because when you have forest, they kind of increase the transpiration of vapor. So they increase the evaporation of water, and that leads to the formation of clouds, which ultimately leads to the addition of precipitation. So when you cut this off, it means that the evaporation or the water vapor in your atmosphere will then decrease, which then will ultimately lead to a decrease in your precipitation. So those are the trying to show that these things are linked together and they interact with each other to kind of give us a different climate based on what is happening. Another thing that we can look at is still the water vapor feedback. So normally the climate does change and it warms up based on different things. But if we have a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, it also means that we're increasing the chances of having these greenhouse gases that trap the radiation that comes from the surface itself. And that ultimately leads to what we know today as global warming. So yeah, so it's just kind of to show that these things interact with each other and they give off different feedbacks. So for example, if our temperatures are currently increasing, that means that our poles or our ice levels will ultimately kind of decrease and they will melt. And if that happens, then it means our sea level rise will increase. And if that happens, it means that whatever we do on the people that stay along the sides of the islands that are closer to those oceans will be impacted. And that has implications also again on the species that stay there and so forth. So it's all trying to make you understand that these things are interlinked and they have feedbacks, and the feedbacks may be positive or they may be negative, but they all interact together to kind of give us the climate that we know today and the climate that we don't know will be in the future. So there has been quite a few reports and scientific knowledge at the moment, and there is evidence that we are currently experiencing extreme events here in South Africa as well. If you look at the case of Cape Town, we almost had day zero because the droughts were very intense, and that was not even a more city scale thing. It affected all regions in South Africa, but at different scales, because we all have a different capacity to kind of adapt and trail off to these things. There's also been an increase of heat waves, and the temperatures are increasing as well. The dry spells have been increasing, and if you look at the case of Durban, I'm not sure if some of you have seen this before. Normally in KZN it rains in summer, and we know that there will be high rainfall at a certain duration around spring to summer, and this has different impacts. But if you look at the past 4 or 5 years, the intensity of the rainfall has increased. The impact has increased. We've lost so many lives and so many infrastructure because the climate is kind of changing based on the things that we have been doing over the past few years. This also means that there are many ecological systems and landscapes that are changing based on what is happening. They're being degraded. A lot of forests are being cut down, and that again has an effect on what will happen in the future. When we look at the reports that have came out, they have said that our temperature in South Africa would kind of increase between 2 to about 6 degrees, depending on where you are in Africa, or in South Africa rather. So overall, South Africa will kind of experience drier conditions. So, and that has implication on how we do our economy, how people do their livelihoods. We know we are a very inequality country, and a lot of people still depend on agriculture and so forth. So that has an implication on them. How are they going to do their livelihoods or their plantations? When are they supposed to plant now? Because there's an understanding that our seasons will change. The onset of rainfall will not be the same as what we see now. It may not start in September like we normally think. What would they happen? What would they do, and how would they take that into account? There are areas as well that are projected to have wetter conditions. So even though in Cape Town we kind of see a drier condition, in KZN when the rains are coming, we're seeing flooding. So they have different implications and at different scales and at different times. So just to bring you back to the IPCC. So that was the more scientific overview of what happens and how things interact with each other to give us different climates at different times. The IPCC firstly started around 1992 when they realized that the climate is a bit changing, the temperatures are increasing, and there has to be some action that has to be taken. So they had a conference amongst different countries to kind of come up with adaptation and initiations to kind of look at climate as an issue that will affect everyone, and it's something that cannot be ignored. That resulted in multiple assessment reports. The one was the protocol, which was the second assessment report, and that has changed, and it kind of assembles different scientists to come up together and review papers and literature on climate change and climate change impacts across the world so that we understand what are the implications at the moment, what has happened before, and what are they kind of projected into the future, what will likely happen under different scenarios. So we'll have a scenario whereby if we take things business as usual as they are today, we continue with our fossil fuels, we continue increasing the greenhouse gases that ultimately lead to the warming of our temperatures and so forth, what will be the changes in temperature or rainfall or heat waves or sea level rise and so forth. So they do all of that at different scales. And around last year, they came together and they tried to look at what we call an assessment, the special assessment report. So it wasn't, it was a bit different from what had happened before. So people had thought that, no, the temperature may increase above 2 degrees from what it was previously. But based on the events and extreme events that are currently happening at the moment, they kind of thought maybe it's worth trying to see and understand whether are we supposed to increase our temperature above 1.5 and what are the implications of trying to keep everything below 1.5 or going beyond that. So that's why the special report is called 1.5. So it's trying to justify if there is any importance of trying to limit our temperatures below 1.5 and see what are the implications for that. They're currently working on the 6th assessment report, and there are a few South African academics that are working on this and contributing, and then I think it will come up in 2023, and then that will also tell us where we are at the moment and how things will change into the future. Okay. So just to kind of sum it up, the implication was that they wanted to explore the potential for 1.5. So what are the impacts of 1.5 degrees other than keeping things below 2 degrees altogether? And this was very much a north-orientated things because they started to see these different extreme events that were happening out there. So this included droughts in California, the fires that were taking place there. They also had a series of hurricanes that were also taking place at a very rapid time, and they were very intense, and there were so many of them. They had about 5 or 6 happening in a very short period of time. So they tried to understand whether if this is happening now and we're just under 1 degree, what will happen if we are at 1.5? So this is also trying to show the correlation between the CO2 concentration and the temperature. You can clearly see that there is that correlation between the two. The fact that our CO2 concentrations are going up has kind of led to the fact that we are now having increased temperatures globally. We are currently sitting around at that point star, and our temperatures are around, have increased about 0.8 to 1 degree above the pre-industrial temperatures. We can jump this. So the special report, what does it actually say? So it is saying that it is possible, it's still possible to kind of limit our warming levels below 1.5, although we've just passed 1 degree and in some areas 1.2 degrees, but we can still, we still have a chance of rather decreasing these things to be below 1.5. However, this will require all of you, especially the financial part of things. It will require a transformation on our urban, our land use, our energy, and our industrial systems. And in order to do that, we have about a chance of 50% reduction and being there by 2030 if our emissions are reduced by 45% or above. And if we want to be carbon neutral, it also means that we'll have to reduce our usage of coal. And the other significant thing that is coming out of this is that initially they had thought that if we have a 2-degree temperature increase, it won't make much difference as having a 1.5. But in fact, there is a significant difference. So the extreme events that might happen when we have a 2-degree as compared to 1.5 are quite significant. If we look at the case of South Africa, there is evidence that if we reduce our temperatures or limit them to at least 1.5 degrees, our drought risk can be reduced. So this, again, trying to reiterate that this will require a lot of change and a lot of transition between different industries and to work together. So for that to happen, they've kind of come up with what we call the climate finance triple jump, which means that we need to increase our investment. Our investment has to kind of shift from coal to other renewable energy, and it should have a societal impact. So not only looking at how things will change in the future and how, but look at the benefits that will come in terms of societal impact and so forth. So one of the things that they say is that we have a choice of whether we want to kind of have tons of carbon that are either 100 or 1,000. And that has an implication. We know at the moment there are certain things that we're trying, but it's better to kind of reach 100 reduction other than trying to reach 1,000. And that's possible with refinancing our systems and so forth. Just to summarize a bit, there has been a lot of things that has happened after this report came out, and after understanding that the issues that are happening. There are youth involvements, and we know how strikes are in South Africa. We had this earlier this year, the climate strike, and South Africa kind of partaked in this as well. There are some policies that are being, energy policies that are being utilized throughout the world and trying to kind of shift our understanding and our usage of coals and into moving towards more renewable energy so that we also contribute in the reduction of greenhouse gases. So in terms of South Africa, it also means that we will have to, like I said, the implications for South Africa will be quite different. But at the same time, there's something that we can do, which also goes to how we change our use of energy and how we can try and move towards renewable energy and so forth. There are litigations that are currently going on in trying to understand this, but there's also a more controversial part of how just this transition will be. Are we supposed to now cut off our coal when the US had benefited from this years ago? But at the same time, we also need to understand that when we do this, it doesn't mean that when we change from coal to something else, we are decarbonizing inequality or we're reducing poverty, but we're rather trying to see the new creations that they may come about with. We may create more jobs and decent jobs that come with renewable energy and skilling people differently. So we may look at trying to come out with more resilient and agriculture and so forth, trying to make cities more livable other than being polluted with a lot of emissions and so forth. So there's still a long way to go, but there is clearly something, as you guys are the finance people, can invest in this and kind of shift things and ensure that there is something that we try and look at and do our part in terms of reducing our emissions and so forth. Thank you.